a protest, a riot, a change in government, the eruption of war. But if that were solely to be the case, I wouldn't be stood in front of you right now. So, what if I were to tell you that what truly dictates how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis is actually silence? But when I'm talking about silence, of course, we're not referring to the absence of speech. I'm referring to silence as a structure to maintain conformity. And that sounds very abstract, I know. So to break it down for you, you know when you go into an elevator and there's like 3 or 4 people in there and it's quite awkward and you don't necessarily know if there's room, but then instinctively everyone sort of makes room for you anyway, so then you smile at people in the elevator to praise their good deed. Or if you want to ask for a raise from your boss, but you don't really want the hassle that's caused by that, or if you want a remark of a paper, but again, you don't want to annoy your teacher, and you have the subsequent reluctance that follows that. These are things that Durkheim would refer to as social facts. Norms so deeply internalized that we mistake them for being instinctual. But of course, when we're referring to social norms, very few are actually biological. The vast majority, if not all, stem from millennia of social change, or contemporary politics. For example, if you think of patriarchy, for instance, patriarchy is prevalent in all societies, but it's far more loud in Afghanistan than it is in, say, Norway. And to give you a more trivial example, anyone with an ounce of public speaking experience will know that the first rule of public speaking is to always maintain eye contact with the crowd. And of course, while this is a gimmick, it does show you the significance of that. Because when I first turned around, you experienced a sense of awkwardness. You didn't necessarily know what I was doing, and some of you may have been a little bit concerned as to where this was going. And, sorry, but you'd be wrong. Because I think that you guys are paying more attention to me than you were before, because I forced a rupture in the social fabric between us. When you sat down, you agreed that I'd look at you and you'd look at me, and then the rest is history. But because I forced this rupture, you're now confused as to what I'm actually doing. Which leads me on to Bourdieu. Now, Bourdieu had this term for the quiet regulation of the self, stemmed by historical factors that impact the societies, racial dynamics, linguistic codes, class distinctions. He coined that term as habitus. It's why, for example, when a politician speaks in an eloquent manner and comes from an upper-class background, we're more likely to deem that politician to be capable. But when politician B comes around the corner and you don't necessarily appreciate the way they speak in casual dialogue or possibly racial vernacular, you're more concerned as to how that politician would operate in office. And on top of that, you imagine both these politicians to be men, which just goes to show how habitus has an impact on your life, even if you don't believe in these class distinctions, gender dynamics, or racial dynamics for that matter. And of course, politician A and politician B can be performative. Politician A could be putting up this character to bring about that plausible capability, while politician B could be performing this character whereby they present themselves as more relatable. Which swiftly leads me on to Goffman. Now, Goffman believed that every single act that we commit, me standing on stage right now, you watching, is to some extent performative. And the issue that stems from that is, if we're all playing in this theater, we're all assigned different characters, at birth, that is, we didn't write our scripts, nor were all scripts created with the same attention to detail. And to give more historical grounding to that, Miss Carter over there will know that in 1955, Rosa Parks refused to stand up from her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. In a segregationist state, where segregation was codified into law, meaning that what she did was she violated a social norm that had forced black people to endure decades and centuries of marginalization. But what she did expanded beyond that, because it signaled the capacity for grassroots activism to violate social norms and ultimately would result in the Montgomery bus boycott and, to some extent, result in the passage of the Civil Rights Act a decade later. But of course, sometimes social norms are maintained, and they lead to the suffering of various individuals. If you fast forward around 3 decades to the 80s, when the AIDS crisis erupted in the States and government response was minimal, it wasn't minimal because of disease, it was minimal because of the taboo associated with the spread of the disease. So what people weren't dying from was AIDS. They were dying from institutionalized reluctance to deal with that disease. So in that sense, government silence equals death, which is where the movement behind me stemmed from. But of course, how do social norms relate to that? Now, please raise your hand if you've ever heard the term to agree to disagree, or when pragmatism was praised by someone that you don't really think meant that, or when inequality was maintained even though it could easily be overridden. See, that's what I'm referring to, because what social norms do isn't just protect these systems. They protect these systems when they could otherwise survive our scrutiny. But of course, in some contexts, that scrutiny still can't be accessed. Around 70% of the global population lives in what is deemed an authoritarian state, whereby they're placed into a binary: be silent or face the consequences. Now, of course, in these societies, it's very hard for you to rebel, to stop playing your character, to reject your script. Because through your life, you have engaged in the hidden curriculum, where you're taught that professionalism equates to neutrality, not to question authority, and that authority is loud. I mean, how many times did your teacher speak to you as if you were a friend? How many times did your parents, when you were growing up, tell you to follow a rule in a not so aggressive manner after you've done something mischievously wrong? See, that's what I'm referring to here, because you've grown into these norms just by living. You weren't taught these things. You were implicitly told when you were growing up that X is good and Y is bad. Now, to conclude, I'd like to refer back to Goffman's concept. Now, if you want to think about performativity, I want to ask you a few questions. First, what would happen? Not if you rebelled or rioted or caused a hassle, but rather if you just refused to act in accordance with your script. What would happen as a result? Which characters in your play have suffered the most from the setting by which you are in? Who has benefited the most? All of these critical questions, while form part of an analogy, equate to our day-to-day lives. What social norms have resulted in the most suffering in your community? Which ones have benefited your community? Has that had an impact on the inequality present in our society? Thank you.